serious. They actually are serious.
There are approximately 1.5 million documented foreign nationals living in South Africa, and on the day the latest wave of mass protests erupted, a significant number of them, Nigerians, Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, Congolese, did not go to work. They did not open their shops, they locked their doors and waited. Not because of a curfew, not because of a court order, because in South Africa, recent history has taught them that when certain streets fill with organized marchers, foreign-owned businesses tend to burn first. While every headline is calling this a story about South African unemployment and anti-immigrant sentiment, nobody is asking the question that sits underneath all of it. Why does a country whose own constitution explicitly guarantees the security of every person within its borders, citizen and non-citizen alike, produce a situation where Nigerians have learned that their constitutional rights do not reliably protect them during a political march? There is a specific South African government policy document, not a protest slogan, not a court ruling, but a government ministry document that laid the operational groundwork for what you are seeing on these streets today. Most Nigerians in South Africa have never heard of it. We will come back to it. Stay with me. This is not what it looks like from the outside. If you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media won't. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper.
A new wave of mass protests has erupted across South Africa, organized primarily under the banners of Operation Dudula and Put South Africa First. The triggering events in this cycle are a combination of a widely circulated social media narrative linking a high-profile crime incident to foreign nationals, Statistics South Africa's most recent unemployment data showing official unemployment above 32% and youth unemployment above 60% for the third consecutive quarter, and the political calendar approaching South Africa's 2026 local government elections, which create incentives for movements with electoral ambitions to demonstrate street mobilization capacity. Protest activity has been reported in Johannesburg CBD, parts of Pretoria, and areas of Durban. Nigerian, Zimbabwean, Congolese, and Somali-owned businesses have been primary targets. Residents in affected areas, both foreign nationals and South African neighbors who depend on those businesses, reported staying indoors as the marches progressed. Operation Dudula emerged as a formal movement in 2021 under the leadership of Nhlanhla Lux Dlamini, a Soweto-born activist who has built a national profile from street-level xenophobic mobilization. The movement is not, as it is sometimes characterized, a spontaneous community response. It applies for legal march permits, it holds press conferences, it has a documented social media strategy, and its leadership has signaled ambitions beyond activism. Dlamini has publicly discussed parliamentary participation ahead of the 2026 local elections. Put South Africa First is a parallel online origin movement that has translated social media mobilization, particularly on Twitter X, into street-level action, with a specific focus on West African nationals, particularly Nigerians, allegedly operating in informal business sectors. Both movements operate in the political space vacated by an ANC government that has failed to deliver on post-apartheid economic promises across 30 years of majority rule. South Africa's 2024 general elections produced a historic result. The ANC lost its outright parliamentary majority for the first time since 1994. The resulting government of national unity, pairing the ANC with the DA and several smaller parties, is politically fragile and internally contradictory on immigration policy. The DA pushes for stricter enforcement of immigration law, while ANC factions are sensitive to SADC regional relations and the Pan-African solidarity narrative that is foundational to ANC identity. This policy paralysis creates a vacuum that organized street movements fill. The 2026 local elections are the specific electoral horizon that makes this protest cycle politically significant. A movement that can demonstrate mass street mobilization capacity in 2025 becomes a factor either as a threat or as a potential coalition partner for parties campaigning in township wards in 2026. 2008, the first large-scale xenophobic violence in post-apartheid South Africa kills 62 people and displaces approximately 100,000. Foreign nationals from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Nigeria bear the primary impact. Government response is condemned as slow and insufficient. 2015, a second major wave in KwaZulu-Natal and Johannesburg, looting, violence, and displacement. Several Nigerians among those killed. The Nigerian government issues formal diplomatic protests. 2019, a severe and specifically anti-Nigerian cycle of attacks targets Nigerian-owned businesses across multiple provinces. Nigeria recalls its high commissioner, threatens economic sanctions against South African companies operating in Nigeria, and forces an emergent bilateral commission. The result produces formal apologies from the South African government and the establishment of a joint binational commission framework, 2021 to present. Operation Dudula formalizes the movement, giving it a name, a face, legal infrastructure, and political ambitions. The cycle is no longer spontaneous, it is organized.
Section 9 of the South African Constitution guarantees equality and prohibits unfair discrimination. Section 12 guarantees every person the right to freedom and security of the person, including the right to be free from all forms of violence from either public or private sources. Both sections apply to everyone within South Africa's territory, citizens and non-citizens alike. This is not a contested constitutional interpretation. It is the explicit text. The Refugees Act No. 130 of 1998 and the Immigration Act No. 13 of 2002 provide the legal framework governing foreign national status and treatment. Both are acknowledged across multiple South African legal and civil society analyses to be applied unevenly in practice, particularly during civil unrest. SAPS is chronically under-resourced in the townships where most protest activity and associated violence occur. The official police-to-population ratio in many affected areas falls below recommended levels. Officers who are aware that intervening aggressively against large protest crowds risks political backlash, particularly from ANC ward councillors who depend on the same communities for votes, face a structural disincentive to robust protection of foreign nationals. The SARHC can investigate and recommend, but has no enforcement powers. Its previous recommendations on xenophobic violence cycles, including post-2019, have been acknowledged and largely implemented at the level of formal bilateral mechanisms while leaving operational practice unchanged. The Nigerian High Commission can issue advisories, request bilateral meetings, and make formal diplomatic representations, but has no operational capacity to physically protect Nigerian nationals in Johannesburg, Durban, or Pretoria when marches are occurring. Operation Dudula has applied for and been granted legal permits to march in several municipalities. The legal legitimacy of the march coexists uneasily with the illegal acts, looting, assault, arson, that sometimes accompany them. This creates a specific institutional challenge. SAPS cannot disperse a lawfully permitted march on the basis that some participants may commit illegal acts. It can only respond to illegal acts as they occur. In practice, this means the institutional protection arrives after the harm, not before it. The legal distinction between documented and undocumented foreign nationals is used by protest organizers to imply that undocumented migrants deserve no protection, a constitutionally incorrect position that has nonetheless influenced both public discourse and, in some documented instances, SAPS operational discretion in how incidents are classified and responded to.
Each protest cycle raises Operation Dudula's national profile, media coverage, and grassroots recruitment capacity. The movement's leadership understands that South Africa's 2026 local election calendar creates a window in which street mobilization translates into political capital. By demonstrating the ability to organize large, legally permitted marches in multiple provinces simultaneously, Dudula signals to established parties that it controls a mobilizable constituency and that that constituency can be courted or threatened. The protest cycle is not separate from the electoral calculation. It is the electoral strategy. The GNU's primary internal tension on this issue is between the ANC's Pan-African solidarity identity, which makes formally supporting anti-immigrant sentiment impossible, and its need to recover township support that has been hemorrhaging to the EFF, MK Party, and now to movements like Operation Dudula. The GNU will issue statements calling for calm and law enforcement. The test is whether those statements are followed by sustained operational deployment, or whether they are cover for looking the other way. ANC ward councillors in affected areas face a specific calculation. The foreign national community does not vote in local elections. The protesting community does. The political incentive structure at the ward level is not aligned with robust protection of foreign nationals, and SAP's operational culture in those wards reflects that misalignment. Operation Dudula leadership, profile, recruitment, political capital ahead of 2026 elections. EFF and MK Party both can reference the protests as evidence of the failure of the Rainbow Nation project without formally endorsing illegal acts, reinforcing their economic nationalist brand without taking the legal risk of supporting violence. South African informal business competitors, township spaza shop competitors of foreign nationals, see temporary market space when foreign-owned shops close. This is the silent economic beneficiary that no political actor acknowledges. South African formal sector wholesalers in the short term, but this is offset by reduced township economic activity overall. The ANC-GNU. Every uncontrolled protest cycle is an advertisement for governmental incompetence, damaging the administration's credibility with international investors and multilateral partners. South Africa's investment climate. The country's political risk indices are monitored by the World Bank, IMF, and major FDI sources. Repeated xenophobic cycles compound reputational damage. Nigeria-South Africa bilateral relations, already strained since 2019. Each cycle deposits another layer of accumulated grievance that reduces goodwill in trade, investment, and diplomatic contexts. South African township economies in the medium term. As the pattern interrupt two analysis documents, the informal supply chain that foreign nationals provide does not automatically self-replace. South Africa's 2026 local government elections are the specific political horizon that makes this protest cycle strategically significant rather than merely episodic. Operation Dudula and Put South Africa First are building organizational infrastructure, membership, media presence, match permit experience that translates into ward-level electoral capacity. The ANC, DA, EFF, and MK Party are all reading this infrastructure development and making calculations about whether to compete against it or attempt to co-opt its constituency. The ANC's temptation will be to adopt anti-immigration language at the ward level to recover lost township votes while maintaining Pan-African rhetoric at the national level. This is not a sustainable political position, but it is the path of least short-term resistance for councillors fighting competitive wards. SADC heads of state, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Zambia, watch developments in South Africa carefully. All have significant national populations in South Africa. Their diplomatic silence reflects the power asymmetry within SADC, not the absence of concern. MTN and other South African companies with major Nigerian operations face a specific strategic calculation. Their Nigerian market access depends partly on the bilateral diplomatic relationship remaining functional. The Nigerian government's response to xenophobic cycles directly affects the commercial environment for South African companies in Nigeria. MTN senior management monitors these diplomatic cycles closely.
A government that cannot enforce its own constitution's protection guarantees uniformly, that produces a situation in which legal residents hide indoors because they cannot rely on state protection, is a government with a legitimacy gap between its stated values and its operational capacity. The GNU's historical claim to Pan-African moral leadership is structurally eroded by each protest cycle that goes inadequately managed. This is not a criticism of individual political leaders. It is an assessment of institutional design failure. For South Africa's formal economy, the informal sector accounts for approximately 6% of GDP and a significantly higher proportion of township economic activity. Foreign nationals are disproportionately active in this sector. Disruption of their economic participation, closures, displacements, departures, reduces township economic output, creates gaps in supply chains that serve both the informal and formal sectors, and signals to international business communities that South Africa's political risk environment is deteriorating. For Nigeria, remittances from Nigerians in South Africa, while not among Nigeria's largest remittance corridors, represent real household income for Nigerian families. Repeated displacement cycles interrupt these flows. The economic impact on Nigerian families is direct and immediate, even when the diplomatic response is slow. For South Africa's FDI outlook, the IMF, World Bank, and major development finance institutions factor political risk into lending and investment conditions. Repeated high-visibility xenophobic violent cycles are a flag in risk assessments that raises the effective cost of capital for South African projects. When documented, economically contributing foreign nationals are repeatedly driven underground or out of the country. They are sometimes replaced by networks that are less visible, less documented, and less cooperative with local law enforcement. The expulsion cycle, intended to reduce crime, can inadvertently create conditions that are harder to police, not easier. The criminal network narrative, the documented association of some Nigerian criminal organizations with drug trafficking, cybercrime, and fraud in South Africa, is real and documented by Interpol and the South African NPA. It is being used selectively and disproportionately to create a collective reputational burden on the Nigerian community as a whole. The analytical challenge is to hold both facts simultaneously. Nigerian criminal networks exist in South Africa and are a legitimate law enforcement concern, and the vast majority of Nigerians in South Africa are legal residents, economic contributors, and constitutional rights holders who are not involved in criminal activity and should not be treated as though they are.
The US State Department and UK FCDO both issue travel advisories for South Africa during xenophobic violence cycles. These advisories do not specifically protect Nigerian nationals, but they signal international diplomatic attention and affect South Africa's soft power standing with partners whose development finance it needs. The EU, whose development partnership with South Africa includes governance benchmarks, is monitoring the GNU's operational response. Anti-immigration mobilization is a documented global pattern in the 2020s, from the US southern border debate to UK small boats policy to Italy's Mediterranean posture. South Africa is participating in this global pattern from a specific position. It is occurring within the African continent among African states with majority black populations targeting other majority black populations. This disrupts the racial solidarity narrative foundational to post-colonial African politics. For the African Union and ECOWAS, which monitor Nigerian democratic processes and intra-African mobility norms, the spectacle of repeated South African xenophobic cycles sends a signal about the structural health of the continental project that goes beyond individual incidents. The most defensible version of the protest constituency's position is this: South Africa has a real, large, and structurally undocumented immigration population whose impact on public services, healthcare queues, housing waiting lists, school admissions is felt at the household level in townships that are already under-resourced.
The state has demonstrated insufficient capacity to process asylum claims within legal timeframes, to distinguish between documented and undocumented residents efficiently, or to enforce immigration law in ways that communities experience as fair and consistent. The frustration of communities experiencing genuine resource pressure is not invented, even when the proposed solutions are constitutionally impermissible and empirically counterproductive. Collective punishment of an entire national or ethnic group for the documented crimes of a subset is constitutionally impermissible under South African law and demonstrably counterproductive as a crime reduction strategy. The research literature on this is not ambiguous. Economic expulsion of informal sector participants does not create formal sector jobs. It reduces the economic activity that generates demand for both formal and informal employment. State capacity failure is a governance problem, not an immigration problem. South Africa's official unemployment rate was above 25% before the post-2008 immigration influx. The structural causes of that unemployment, apartheid spatial legacy, inadequate investment in township education and skills development, the underperformance of post-apartheid industrial policy, are entirely internal to South Africa's own governance record.
The US State Department and UK FCDO both issue travel advisories for South Africa during xenophobic violence cycles. These advisories do not specifically protect Nigerian nationals, but they signal international diplomatic attention and affect South Africa's soft power standing with partners whose development finance it needs. The EU, whose development partnership with South Africa includes governance benchmarks, is monitoring the GNU's operational response. Anti-immigration mobilization is a documented global pattern in the 2020s, from the US southern border debate to UK small boats policy to Italy's Mediterranean posture. South Africa is participating in this global pattern from a specific position. It is occurring within the African continent, among African states, with majority black populations targeting other majority black populations. This disrupts the racial solidarity narrative foundational to post-colonial African politics. For the African Union and ECOWAS, which monitor Nigerian democratic processes and intra-African mobility norms, the spectacle of repeated South African xenophobic cycles sends a signal about the structural health of the continental project that goes beyond individual incidents. The most defensible version of the protest constituency's position is this: South Africa has a real, large and structurally undocumented immigration population whose impact on public services, healthcare queues, housing waiting lists, school admissions is felt at the household level in townships that are already under-resourced. The state has demonstrated insufficient capacity to process asylum claims within legal timeframes, to distinguish between documented and undocumented residents efficiently, or to enforce immigration law in ways that communities experience as fair and consistent. The frustration of communities experiencing genuine resource pressure is not invented, even when the proposed solutions are constitutionally impermissible and empirically counterproductive. Collective punishment of an entire national or ethnic group for the documented crimes of a subset is constitutionally impermissible under South African law and demonstrably counterproductive as a crime reduction strategy. The research literature on this is not ambiguous. Economic expulsion of informal sector participants does not create formal sector jobs. It reduces the economic activity that generates demand for both formal and informal employment. State capacity failure is a governance problem, not an immigration problem. South Africa's official unemployment rate was above 25% before the post-2008 immigration influx. The structural causes of that unemployment, apartheid spatial legacy, inadequate investment in township education and skills development, the underperformance of post-apartheid industrial policy, are entirely internal to South Africa's own governance record.
3 misconceptions in public discourse. 1. This is a spontaneous community response to crime. Operation Dudula applies for legal march permits, holds planned press conferences, and its leadership has stated electoral ambitions. This is an organized political movement using crime narratives as mobilizing rhetoric, not a spontaneous community response. 2. Foreign nationals in South Africa are economic competitors taking South African jobs. The empirical evidence on this is mixed. Foreign nationals are disproportionately represented in self-employment and enterprise creation. They tend to create economic activity and employment rather than simply compete for existing positions. The job-stealing narrative does not survive contact with the South African labor market data. 3. Nigeria can do nothing about how South Africa treats its citizens. Nigeria has a deployed, previously effective toolkit: diplomatic recall, economic leverage on South African companies, AU platform mobilization. It has used this toolkit before. Whether it uses it in this cycle is a political choice, not a capacity limitation. Nigeria's national interest in this situation is not simply humanitarian. There are approximately 1.5 million documented Nigerians in South Africa, many operating businesses, employing South Africans, and remitting income home. They are an economic constituency, and they are currently underprotected by both the South African state and the Nigerian diplomatic apparatus. For Nigeria's long-term continental positioning specifically, Nigeria aspires to continental leadership through ECOWAS, through the AU, and through its cultural and economic influence across West and Central Africa. A Nigeria that cannot deploy its 2019 diplomatic toolkit to protect its citizens in Africa's most developed economy, when that toolkit demonstrably worked the last time it was used, cannot credibly claim continental leadership. This is not a soft power question. It is a hard credibility question about whether Nigeria's bilateral relationships are backed by political will or by diplomatic language alone. For Southwest Nigeria specifically, the Southwest's political strategy has historically depended on a functional federal government with active continental credibility to maximize its own leverage on federal resources and policy priorities. A federal government that is perceived internationally as unable to protect its citizens abroad, in addition to its well-documented domestic economic challenges, reduces the diplomatic standing that Southwest political actors benefit from when engaging with Abuja on regional interests.
Regardless of how this specific cycle resolves, South Africa's recurring xenophobic violence is creating a structural shift in how African governments approach bilateral relations with Pretoria. The diplomatic patience of Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Zambia is not infinite. Each cycle deposits another layer of accumulated grievance. The AU's long-term aspiration of continental free movement, the Agenda 2063 framework that South Africa has formally endorsed, becomes more difficult to advance politically as a South African domestic political movement that targets intra-African migrants gains electoral credibility. The deeper structural question is whether South Africa's constitutional democracy can withstand the pressure of organized movements that use legal instruments, march permits, press conferences, electoral strategies, while producing illegal outcomes, violence, looting, arson, that the state is structurally disincentivized to contain. The answer to that question will define the trajectory of South African democracy for the next decade and the safety of millions of Africans who have made South Africa their economic home. We opened with a locked door, not a legal order. Not a curfew. A learned response, the product of 2008, 2015, and 2019, informing the behavior of 2025. A Nigerian shopkeeper in Johannesburg or Durban knows from documented historical evidence that when certain streets fill with organized marchers, the constitutional guarantee of Section 12 of the South African Constitution does not reliably translate into operational protection. That gap between constitutional text and lived reality is what this video has been mapping. The question it builds towards is not whether Operation Dudula is legally entitled to march. It is whether South Africa's institutions, its police service, its human rights commission, its governing coalition, are functioning in a way that makes the constitutional promise of equal protection mean something to the 1.5 million people it formally covers who are not South African citizens. On the evidence of 4 documented cycles of recurring violence, the honest institutional assessment is not consistently enough. And for Nigeria, the question is equally direct. The diplomatic toolkit that worked in 2019 still exists. The economic leverage that produced South African government apologies and a bilateral commission framework is still there. Whether it is deployed, and with what sustained political will, is the test of whether Nigeria's continental leadership aspiration is backed by action or by aspiration alone. Drop your analysis in the comments. Do you think Nigeria should activate its 2019 diplomatic playbook in full? And if the Tinubu administration does not, what should Nigerian civil society do instead? If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.